World War II was nearing its end. Germany had already surrendered months ago, yet the Japanese continued to fight on the losing side. On July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Declaration was issued. It called for the complete surrender of the Japanese military, promising destruction if they were to continue fighting. No reply from the Japanese came for 11 days, prompting the United States to send the Enola Gay on its mission. On August 6th, Hiroshima became the first target of atomic weaponry in history. As the Japanese continuously refused to surrender, the United States, authorized by President Truman, dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. Reactions from Japanese leaders Hirohito and Suzuki expressed defeat, while Americans were left uninformed on the scale of what happened. Destruction in Hiroshima revolutionized war ethics and medical studies in radiation exposure. Hiroshima survivors and descendants continue to push for reform against atomic weaponry to this day. On December 7, 1941, Japan sent planes above Pearl Harbor from 6 aircraft carriers that traveled close to the Hawaiian Islands just days prior. In merely 90 minutes, they attacked the unprepared military port. Over 2,000 American military personnel were killed, with hundreds of aircraft being damaged or completely destroyed. President at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, called it a day which will live in infamy, and reacted with a declaration of war against Japan the very next day. Japan, as a nation, found victories through quick and unpredictable attacks, even doing so against China in World War II. The bombing was seen as a way to hopefully gain control over the Pacific. Japan, of course, was not the only enemy of the United States in World War II. Nazi Germany posed a threat to American safety for much of the war until Hitler's suicide. A Manhattan Project, started in 1942, sought to take the greatest minds in the United States and work towards the creation and deployment of the first atomic weaponry. This was in competition with Germany, another intellectual superpower, hastily working at technological advancement. The Manhattan Project had also received help from European scientists who had fled Nazi persecution, putting the United States at a great advantage. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. Harry Truman, his successor, came into office under immense pressure. It was his task to end World War II as soon as he could for the safety of his people and his public opinion. Fortunately for him, Germany's surrender had left Japan as the primary enemy. A part of Japan's Bushido Code requires a noble warrior to fight until the very end, with Prime Minister Suzuki and the government using it as a means to encourage the military to not stop fighting. They were not entirely concerned with humongous losses and would go to extreme lengths to win. As American citizens grew increasingly frustrated with the war, the United States government knew they needed a quick solution to end it. During the Trinity test, a testing of an atomic bomb in the deserts of New Mexico, the Manhattan Project scientists were able to see the scale of what they had created. The revolutionary test sparked a movement against atomic bombs, with Manhattan Project scientist Leo Szilard quickly drafting a petition urging Truman to avoid the use of such destructive weaponry on Japan. 70 scientists signed the final version, but unfortunately, the petition was never seen by the president. Truman was in Potsdam ready to plan the attack against Japan with the Allies. After being informed of the Trinity test results, he set out to end World War II with the threat of atomic destruction. The Potsdam Declaration was issued on July 26, 1945. It called for the surrender of Japan. However, Japan was permitted to maintain its industries that were necessary to maintain the country's stability. The Allies would not receive a response. As opposed to Truman's own wishes, advisors suggested that the atomic bomb be used on an urban target rather than a military one. This ultimately led to Hiroshima being chosen as the city to be destroyed by the bomb. The morning of August 6, 1945, Enola Gay and its dozen-man crew flew over Japan, ready to drop Little Boy on Hiroshima. The bomb dropped, and the crew of the Enola Gay immediately felt the weight of their actions, with co-pilot Robert Lewis stating, "My God, what have we done?" in his flight log. It is estimated that 80,000 people died in the initial blast, with many more to come. Thousands were left severely burned or disfigured. Many paintings were made by survivors showing desolate landscapes, suffering people, and many other horrors. On the American side, however, the information on what truly happened was not published, leaving the general public totally misinformed. Instead, newspapers exaggerated death tolls and bragged about the destruction that Little Boy had left behind. Given the sudden and devastating nature of the Hiroshima bombing, as well as the Nagasaki bombing that happened only days later, the Japanese were left with no option but to surrender. Hirohito sent out the Jewel Voice broadcast on August 15th, admitting defeat but still attempting to salvage the image of himself and the government to the people. Hirohito never actually used the word surrender in the broadcast, and he insisted that if they were to continue the fight, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The abrupt end of the war, as well as the misled reporting of the bombs by American news, contributed to an overwhelming 85% approval rating of the use of the bombs. However, there was still some public backlash. Albert Einstein stated shortly after the bombing, "It's no longer rational to solve international problems by resorting to war," with many others in support. Japanese atomic bomb survivors, known as Hibakusha, were seen as social outcasts. Yoko Mori was 5 years old when Hiroshima was bombed. Children would run away from her, joking that they would be infected. Thousands more experienced the same treatment. A survey reported that 1/5 of Hibakusha were discriminated against in finding marriage, as well as in job searching. Hibakusha would not receive healthcare benefits for a long time if they qualified for it in the first place. In 1963, President Dwight D. Eisenhower recalled that he opposed the use of the bomb during his time as the head of the Allied Expeditionary Force, saying that he didn't want his country to use such a terrible weapon. Public approval for the bombing of Japan in the United States dropped significantly over the following years, showing that reactions from a less war-geared mindset greatly differed. Little Boy's destructive power wasn't just important to Japan and the United States, it was seen worldwide. Colombian writer Eduardo Zalamea wrote about ideas involving the security of atomic bombs shortly after the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The newly formed United Nations had a meeting regarding atomic weaponry. However, no Japanese leaders or researchers were invited to give their thoughts. USSR leader Joseph Stalin's previous knowledge of US atomic research led directly to the Soviet atomic bomb project, which escalated furthermore into the Cold War and nuclear arms race. Although nuclear arms were never actually used during the Cold War, Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombs had created a world in which conventional means of war were vastly inferior. The effects of Hiroshima are still felt years later. In the 2005 documentary Hiroshima, survivor Akiko Takakura described recurring dreams where bodies are floating in a pool or hanging from trees. These were images that she saw during the time of the explosion. Hibakusha, like her, were given the opportunities for medical benefits, including free healthcare, which did not officially begin until 1957. Although help for survivors was very limited, research saw a great benefit. Atomic bomb radiation exposure was linked to liver cancer in a study going from 1958 to 2009. Hibakusha have been imperative in researching the relation between radiation exposure and cardiovascular disease. Despite the original fears on how radiation-exposed bomb survivors might have harshly affected offspring, a study compared children from parents who were exposed and who were not exposed and found no statistical difference in genetic harm between the two groups. Reform against atomic bombs themselves has continued years beyond the attacks on the two Japanese cities. The Geneva Convention Protocol of 1977 entirely prohibits attacks on civilians as well as attacks that may have long-term effects on the natural environment. Both of these regulations apply to atomic bombs like Little Boy, making usage of weapons similar to it completely prohibited. Hibakusha are leading today's resistance against nuclear arms. When the Enola Gay was exhibited in the Smithsonian, many people were there to oppose how the plane was being displayed. Hiroshima Mayor Tadatoshi Akita said that the display appears to worship nuclear weapons at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, majorly altered or killed. Hiroshima was a catalyst for scientific breakthroughs and discussions of international relations.